Kurt Weill believed that Broadway could be the birthplace of a genuine American musical theater, or if you wish, an American opera. When he died in 1950, in the middle of the Golden Age, he was at the height of his ambitions. He had begun collaborations with Maxwell Anderson on a musical adaptation of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and jotted down interest in writing operas based on Moby Dick, Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, and other American classics, as Kim Kowalski has documented in his essay Kurt Weill and the Quest for American Opera. The American period works he did complete revealed the conviction that it was possible to preserve elements of European operatic tradition while catering to popular taste. Remaining faithful to the concept of Zwischengattung, or mixed genre, which he coined in 1926, he was the first to use the term Broadway opera. Street Scene, the self-proclaimed culmination of his efforts as a composer for the theater, transparently folds the drama of late Romantic opera into the frame of a Broadway musical. The work embodies his commitment to opera as an art form in need of renewal, as based on the notion of young classicality he absorbed from his teacher, Ferruccio Busoni. In a 1937 article entitled The Future of Opera in America, Weill envisioned a field for the building of a new, or the rebuilding of a classical form, holding up Mozart's Die Zauberflöte as an ideal example of the union of popular music and the highest degree of artistic power. While he did not believe that America can simply take up this musical theater development right where Europe left off, due to what he called different prerequisites for artistic construction, he wrote that a movement has already begun, which runs parallel to the European, and which will come closer to the goal we set in Europe. His ambitions may have been too lofty. None of his American works enjoyed major Broadway revivals, and therefore would earn only a marginal place in the Broadway canon. As we know, Street Scene closed after a short run of 148 performances at New York's Adelphi Theater, and has since found its place in opera houses on both sides of the Atlantic. Lady in the Dark ran for 777 performances from 1941 to 1943, with only 462 performances taking place in New York, a mere fraction of the record set by Oklahoma, which had received 2,248 performances by 1948. Unlike the hit musicals of Rodgers and Hammerstein, Weill's works did not adhere to Golden Age conventions. He seems to have been as aware of his innovative role as he was bitter about their commercial success. Following the opening of Carousel in 1945, and a month after Weill's Broadway operetta, The Firebrand of Florence, closed after only 43 performances, in comparison with 890 for Carousel, Weill wrote to Lenya expressing his sense of competition in no uncertain terms. In Street Scenes wrapped in a ribbon and tied in a bow, one of two numbers Weill did not orchestrate himself, he pours into music his rivalry with, or perhaps lampoons the successful duo, as he alludes to Carousel. Kowalski explains in his seminal article, Theorizing the Golden Age of Musical, Genre, Structure, Syntax, that both Rodgers and Weill expanded the standard 32-bar popular song form into complex musical scenes, and threw into question the previously specialized roles of lyricist and book writer into the unified contribution of a single collaborator. And yet, while credit went to Oklahoma for establishing the distinction between the genres of musical comedy and musical play, it was Weill who broke the mold with Lady in the Dark. Gisela Schubert concurs that if Weill and Rodgers were both innovators in American musical theater of the 1940s, Rodgers did not transcend the boundaries of the genre, while Weill was motivated by formal experimentation. Lady in the Dark was the first musical drama based on psychoanalysis, influencing not just a range of Broadway shows about psychotherapy, but through the Paramount film version, American Cinema. The musical play in 2 acts absorbs elements from Zeitoper, operetta, and musical comedy, veering with at times filmic cuts between dream sequences and the everyday life of the female protagonist, the magazine editor Liza Elliott, as she struggles to reconcile her professional and private personas in therapy sessions. Despite low box office numbers, Lady in the Dark provided Weill with his first commercial success in the US. It was also a breakthrough for the lyricist Ira Gershwin, the book writer Moss Hart, and the actors Danny Kaye and MacDonald Carey. Street Scene and Weil's last completed stage work, Lost in the Stars, were even more daring formal experimentations in that they introduced tragedy of operatic dimensions to the Broadway stage. As Weil wrote to the critic Olin Downs approximately 2 weeks after the premiere of Lost in the Stars, he set out to write a musical tragedy for the American theater that audiences would accept, despite these operatic dimensions. Downs responded, "This work and the street scene will be among the most significant steps which have so far been taken both to modernize and popularize the operatic principle and say something worthwhile in the artistic sense." For Kowalski, Street Scene staked claim to higher ground in the terrain of Broadway's musical play, territory in which Richard Rodgers had established priority on the popular front with Oklahoma and Carousel. As such, Street Scene served to usher in a series of operas on Broadway by Blitzstein, Menotti, Bernstein, and others during the next decade. One such work remains not just in the American, but the international mainstream, namely Bernstein's West Side Story. The collaborative process through which the show emerged would speak in favor of designating it as a musical. And yet sophisticated symphonic numbers and the central role of the orchestra in telling the story remain stumbling blocks to placing West Side Story exclusively within that genre. Bernstein himself packaged the work as an opera in his 1984 recording for Deutsche Grammophon, enlisting Kiri Te Kanawa and Jose Carreras to sing the roles of Maria and Tony. And yet West Side Story remains firmly planted in the Broadway canon. Like any canon, that of the American musical is contingent upon differentiation. To quote Kowalski, the musical was largely a homegrown product that stood in contrast to the transplanted institutions of symphony orchestra and opera by reifying egalitarian, secular, pragmatic, and anti-elitist values basic to the predominant self-image. At the same time, the melting pot of styles that generated the Golden Age placed European and indigenous elements side by side, declaring a new age of American cultural authority. Recent history has been defined by the emergence of multiple canons rather than a single dominant one, as Anne Schreffler has documented. And yet she notes a kind of mutual interdependence among them all. One canon, it seems, can only emerge by toppling another, or at least defining itself in contradistinction to whatever canon is dominant at the time. It is the musical and not opera that arguably represents the United States national tradition of sung theater. And yet the term musical is often used too broadly to denote works that are hybrids in their construction. Harold Schoenberg, in his 1979 New York Times article, "Why Isn't a Musical Comedy an Opera?" came to the conclusion that most likely a classification is impossible, and one can put up as good an argument for them being musicals as for them being operas. He even suggested that Mozart's Die Zauberflöte could be considered a musical comedy, given the spoken dialogue, elements of humor, and topicality to audiences of its time. Perhaps as important as categorizing works of art is understanding the dynamic relationship between works. A canon cannot be formed without the assimilation or rejection of tradition. Sometimes it is an ambivalent mixture of both. In 1956, Bernstein drew an analogy between the American musical play and the Singspiel tradition to invoke a specific moment in history. This popular form took the leap to a work of art through the genius of Mozart, he said in one of his omnibus lectures on national television. "We are in the same position. All we need is for our Mozart to come along. If and when he does, we surely won't get any magic flute. What we'll get will be a new form, and perhaps opera will be the wrong word for it." While there are clear parallels between Singspiel and the American musical play, in which spoken dialogue and closed numbers alternate to create a hybrid form, the Mozart comparison tacitly serves to enshrine Bernstein as the pivotal figure in a new movement of serious musicals, as Stempel and Kowalski have noted. The rising sixth in the melody at climatic utterances of Maria creates a possible allusion to the aria Dies Bildnis ist bezaubernd schön. The gesture, however small, is what Christopher Reynolds has identified as an assimilative motive of illusion. The meaning of the earlier text is transferred to a new context. Both numbers are in E-flat major, which happens to be the central key of Die Zauberflöte, and both numbers express the emotions of love at first sight. All stylistic considerations aside, Tony's feelings, which can withstand the trials of war or even death, are essentially operatic in substance. West Side Story is also teeming with assimilative allusions to street scene, a story of thwarted summertime romance on the streets of New York. A subtle but critical gesture emerges with the interval of C and F sharp. This tritone surfaces at significant moments in street scene, permeating the ice cream sextet as motors of darkly ironic emphasis and creating non-ironic emphasis to the tragedy of Sam and Rose in their final encounter. For example, under the word together in Don't Forget the Lilac Bush. Further examples include the entrance of Rose's aggressive suitor Easter in number 19, and the final three measures of Wrapped in a Ribbon and Tied in a Bow, with F sharp creating an enharmonic hinge into Sam's E-flat major arioso Lonely House. In West Side Story, the juxtaposition of C and F sharp first enters in the piano and low strings when the Jets snap their fingers in the prologue. In the finale, F sharp undercuts what would otherwise be a rosy C major final chord. The interval is also the byproduct of the double tonic complex of C major and A major, which, as Elizabeth Wells argues, can be traced back to Wagner's Tristan prelude. Allusions to Tristan und Isolde meanwhile saturate street scene to create a subtext about the doomed romance of Sam and Rose. The example at the stringendo of the finale shown here being the culmination or explosion of more subtle references earlier in the score. So what does this web of allusions illustrate? Wells believes that with West Side Story, Bernstein had a very personal stake in creating a work that grew as organically as possible from American roots and was grounded in tonality, but measured up to European standards in its symphonic scope and perceived progressiveness within the genre. Writing in the New York Times in 1956, Bernstein exposed an internal conflict about finding the right formula for Candide, which was conceived parallel to West Side Story and opened a year previously. In a fictive conversation between his irrepressible demon, or the id, and his ego, to which he assigned the initials LB, the ego asks if the dissonant element of an F sharp sounds as though it belongs in a Broadway musical. The id then retorts with a sneer, Broadway musical, I can but smile. In the end, Bernstein reassures himself that he is setting a specific precedent in American theater history with some version of musical theater that is basically European, but which Americans have long ago accepted and come to love. Of course, George Gershwin had expressed similar thoughts in the New York Times 2 decades earlier. Writing about his folk opera Porgy and Bess, he stated that he had created a new form combining opera with theater. He also pointed to the serious form needed to capture the American subject matter, while also noting that an American opera without humor could not possibly run the gamut of American expression. For Weill, who experienced Porgy and Bess in rehearsal 1 month after emigrating to the US, or in October of 1935, the work was evidence that the American theater was already on the way to the more integrated form of musical that we had begun to attempt in Europe. Weill had a hand in shaping Porgy and Bess's posthumous reception when, as an advisor to the producer Charles Crawford for a 1942 revival, he advocated replacing most of the recitative with spoken dialogue, in effect pushing Porgy and Bess more in the direction of the Singspiel tradition. In a 1946 interview, Weill identified the one fault of Porgy and Bess as its tendency to tell everything in music, explaining that in Street Scene, he chose to have dialogue tell 25% of the story. Stempel is certainly correct when he surmises that the success of the Porgy and Bess revival established a precedent for the general viability of producing quality work of operatic ambition on Broadway's terms, including Weill's own. But in Street Scene, Weill's brand of American music theater departs from that of Gershwin in that he does not blend, but rather juxtaposes popular and classical elements in a montage that has its roots in pre-exile works such as Aufstieg und Fall der Stadt Mahagoni. While Stempel argues that the worlds of opera and Broadway melting pot episodes merely coexist without shedding much light on the other, this integration of contrasting material within a score that is unified by classical principles is what made the Broadway opera such a bold endeavor and milestone in American tradition. And yet the formative impact of Weil's American works on the Golden Age has been underplayed in books such as Raymond Knapp's The American Musical and the Formation of National Identity, or Joseph Swain's The Broadway Musical, A Critical and Musical Survey. Swain, meanwhile, credits West Side Story for both successfully incorporating tragedy into the Broadway tradition and for achieving a musical integration, the likes of which Broadway had never heard. Unlike Weil, who set out to reform operatic tradition for the Broadway stage, Bernstein achieves a cool distance from his European predecessors that more easily allowed the show to be palatable as a kind of American opera. Writing 3 months after West Side Story's opening, the critic Olin Downs declared, "We are coming to believe that when the American opera created by a composer of the stature of the Wagners and Verdis of yore does materialize, it will owe much more to the robust spirit and the raciness of our popular theater than to the efforts of our prideful emulators in the upper aesthetic brackets of the tonal art of Bartók, Hindemith, and Stravinsky." The perceived irreconcilability of European art and authentic American expression comes to the fore here. Was it not self-explanatory for American composers to combine the rigor of classical composition with the spirit of indigenous popular theater? On the other hand, if a composer was not American born, was it possible for him to be accepted into the Broadway canon? While Downs had declared in his New York Times obituary of Weil that Lady in the Dark and Street Scene bespoke a new, modern, and essentially American approach to the lyric stage, it is Bernstein who would enter the canon with sophisticated theater music that was idiosyncratically American on the surface, but European in its underlying formal principles. This formula, while heavily streamlined, had found a precedent in Street Scene, which embodied Weil's belief in opera as the most precious vessel for all forms and genres. As such, the Golden Age remains inextricably connected with the short-lived movement of Broadway opera. Stempel considers West Side Story the end of the line in the history of this genre, or the last critically acclaimed and commercially successful example of an extraordinary but marginal development in the tradition of Porgy and Bess. Whether Porgy and Bess is a Broadway opera, a folk opera, or the quintessential American opera remains up for debate. The extent to which Weil pushed Broadway tradition in new directions with Street Scene, or was carrying Gershwin's mantle, could also be the subject of further discussion. But perhaps allowing a space for hybrid works that defy the boundaries between opera and musical theater is useful in acknowledging the Golden Age as a period in search of the formula for a national tradition that could be both tragic and entertaining, serious and popular. And perhaps the model of the Singspiel, particularly Die Zauberflöte, which Ferruccio Busoni considered die Oper schlechtweg, or the opera par excellence, can serve to reconcile the aesthetic divide between American and European tradition, which to this day remains ideologically charged.